picture a flat stretch of land in what we now call northern Louisiana, the air thick and warm, the Mississippi Delta breathing its slow green breath around you. A quick word before we go deeper. These stories don't end. There's a new, unsolved one waiting here every night. If that's the kind of thing you'd leave on in the dark, subscribe and I'll keep them coming. Now come back to that flat stretch of land with me. Stand still a moment. From where your feet are planted, you would see nothing but grass, low ridges, maybe a stand of trees swaying at the edge of your sight. You would not see a city, you would not see a monument. You would only feel, somewhere under your boots, that the ground is not lying flat by accident. It rises and falls in a rhythm too steady to be nature's hand. It curves in a way rivers do not curve, and hills do not settle. If you had stood on this ground 3,600 years ago, you would have stood inside a ring of earth built by human hands, one ring inside another, 6 of them all together wrapping around a plaza wide enough to hold a small town. This is Poverty Point. That name came later, borrowed from a plantation that once claimed this land, and it tells you nothing true about what happened here. The people who built these rings left no name behind, no carved word, no painted symbol we can read like a sentence. They left only the earth itself, moved by hand, basket by basket, for reasons nobody alive today can say for certain. Picture the scale of it for a moment, because the scale is the whole heart of this mystery. Some rings stretch 3/4 of a mile across. The dirt that forms them did not arrive by ox cart or wheelbarrow. There were no draft animals here, no metal shovels, no wheels turning under any kind of cart. Every pound of soil moved across this ground, moved because a person carried it, likely in a woven basket, walking the same path again and again until a wall of earth rose taller than a grown man's head. Think about what that means for the people who did it. Think about the hours. Think about the shoulders, the hands, the calluses built up over seasons, maybe years, hauling earth from one place to another with no promise of shelter or defense waiting at the end of the labor. This was not a fort. This was not a burial mound alone. Whatever this place was, it demanded a kind of commitment we rarely ask of ourselves, today even with machines doing the lifting for us. If you had watched this work from a distance, from the tree line at the edge of the plaza, you would have seen hundreds of people moving in slow, patient lines, day after day, under a Louisiana sun that has not changed 1 degree of its heat since. You would have heard the soft thud of baskets emptying, the low talk between workers, maybe a song passed hand to hand the way work songs travel, and you would have had no way of knowing that 36 centuries later people would stand on this same ground and still not know why. That is the strange gift and the strange ache of this place. Archaeologists have walked these rings for over a century now. They have flown planes above them, mapped them from the air, dug careful trenches into the old soil, and still, no one can say with full certainty who lived here permanently, who came only for gatherings, or what beliefs shaped the exact angles of these curves. The geometry is too precise to call an accident. The labor is too enormous to call a whim. Somebody planned this. Somebody had a reason worth thousands of hours of human effort. That reason walked away into history without leaving so much as a whisper of its name. We call the question open because it truly is open. Every theory you will hear across this story, a gathering place, a trade hub, a calendar built from dirt and shadow, a message aimed at the sky, sits beside a doubt just as strong as the theory itself. That tension is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Somewhere under the grass of northern Louisiana, in ridges that still catch the low light of sunset, just right. A people we cannot name built something we still cannot fully explain, and the ground has been holding that secret quietly, patiently, for 3,600 years, waiting to see if anyone would ever come close enough to understand. Picture northern Louisiana in the early 1800s. The air hangs heavy and warm, thick with the smell of river mud and pine sap. Cotton fields stretch out flat and endless, broken only by stands of cypress and the slow brown curl of Bayou Macon. This is farm country, hard country, where a man clears land with an axe and a mule and calls himself lucky if the soil gives him a good crop before the heat breaks his back. The land here does not look like much at first. It rolls gently, rising and falling in long, low ridges that a tired farmer might blame on nothing more than bad luck with the plow. Spanish moss hangs from the oak branches like grey hair on an old woman, swaying slow in air that never seems to move fast. Mosquitoes hum near the water at dusk. Cicadas scream through the afternoon heat until the sound becomes part of the silence itself. The men who settle this ground carry axes, not shovels made for digging into history. They wear homespun shirts, gone soft and grey with sweat. They carry lanterns fueled by whale oil or tallow, and at night, the only light for miles comes from a cabin window or a cook fire glowing low and orange against the dark. There is no science here, no team of scholars standing by with notebooks. There is only the work of turning wild land into something that can feed a family. When a farmer drags his plow through a fresh field, he expects rocks. He expects roots. He does not expect the ground to rise beneath him in a ridge that curves too smooth, too round, to be anything natural. But that is what happens here, again and again, as farmers push west along the bayou and start breaking new ground. The ridges are not tall. Some barely reach a man's knee, but they run in long, sweeping arcs, one after another, like ripples on a pond frozen into dirt. A farmer walking his fence line might cross 5 or 6 of these ridges without thinking twice. He is trying to grow cotton and corn. He is not trying to solve a riddle left by people who vanished long before his grandfather's grandfather was born. If you had stood in one of those fields in 1830, you would have felt the sun heavy on your neck and the itch of gnats at your collar. You would have seen the rows of cotton bending gently in the breeze, and beneath your boots, without knowing it, you would have been standing on top of a wall built thousands of years before your country had a name. Some of the mounds rise higher, tall enough to make a man stop his mule and stare. One in particular looms over the flat land like a shoulder pushing up from the earth. It slopes steep enough that climbing it leaves a man breathing hard. Local families call it by simple names, practical names, the kind of names people give to things they do not understand, but must live beside anyway. Nobody in these early years thinks to ask who built it. The land is old. Old things are simply part of the land. Steamboats pass on the nearby rivers, their whistles cutting through the humid air, carrying cotton bales, and news from towns half a world away, by the standards of a farm family that rarely travels more than a day's ride from home. Word of these strange earthworks moves slowly, the way most things move in this era. A traveling surveyor might mention them in a letter. A curious planter might walk the ridges on a Sunday afternoon, more out of boredom than wonder. There is no rush to explain them, because there is no sense yet that they need explaining. This is the ordinary world the mystery is born into. Not a laboratory, not a museum, but a cotton field baking under a Louisiana sun, worked by people who have no reason to suspect. They are farming on top of a design older than the pyramids of Egypt. The ridges do not announce themselves. They simply wait, patient as the bayou itself, for someone to finally stop and ask the right question. For decades, that question does not come. The land gets plowed, planted, harvested, and plowed again. Seasons turn, cabins rise and fall, families move on, and new families take their place, inheriting the same curved ridges without inheriting any answers. It will take a stranger's eye, someone looking not for cotton yield, but for shape and pattern, to notice what generations of tired, sunburned farmers walked past every single day. And when that eye finally looks down from just the right angle, what it sees will turn a quiet stretch of Louisiana farmland into one of the strangest puzzles in the story of this continent. Picture a man standing on the highest ridge of dirt. 3,600 years ago, he has no name, we know. No stone marks his grave. But his feet have pressed this same path 100 times, maybe 1,000, carrying baskets of soil up a slope his own hands helped build. His palms are hard as old leather. His shoulders carry the kind of strength that comes only from years of lifting, not from any single day of it. We call these people the Poverty Point culture now, because a plantation once stood nearby with that same sad name. But that name tells you nothing about who they were. It tells you only what a later farmer decided to call his land. The people who built these rings called themselves something else entirely, and that word is gone, swallowed by time the way a river swallows a stone. Try to see them as they were, not as strangers in a museum diagram. A woman kneels by the water's edge, weaving a net from plant fiber, her fingers moving fast and sure. Children run along the crest of the innermost ring, laughing because children always find a way to turn even sacred ground into a playground. An old man sits near a fire, shaping a small stone into the rough form of an owl, and he works slow, patient, like he has done this 1,000 times before and will do it 1,000 times again. These were not wanderers passing through. The evidence says they stayed, at least for stretches of time, in numbers large enough to move mountains of dirt with nothing but baskets and will. Picture the line of them at dawn, backs bent, moving earth handful by handful, basket by basket, for months that turned into years that turned into generations. No ox pulled a cart, no iron blade broke the ground, just human hands doing something that still leaves modern engineers shaking their heads. You have to wonder what kept them coming back to that same ridge above the river, year after year, when so much of the world around them offered easier ground. Maybe someone stood there once and said, "This is the place," and the others believed him enough to start digging. Maybe it wasn't one voice at all, but a slow agreement that built over lifetimes, the way a path through the woods gets worn down by 1,000 different feet who never meet each other. Look closer at what they carried with them. Stone tools made from rock that exists nowhere near this Louisiana bayou. Copper that had to travel from the Great Lakes, passed hand to hand across 1,000 miles of forest and river. If you had watched a trader arrive at the edge of the rings, his pack heavy with red jasper or grey flint, you would have seen the whole camp turn to look. Word would have moved through the rings like wind through tall grass, and people would have gathered, curious, already imagining what they might offer in trade. Their tools tell you about their days, small stone weights, shaped like plump little animals or smooth teardrops, sit scattered across the site by the thousands. Archaeologists call them poverty point objects, and most agree they were fired in cooking pits, heated stones, dropped into holes in the ground to bake food, since no pottery survived long enough here to do that job. This was a people who solved problems with what the earth gave them, patient and clever in ways that modern hands might struggle to match. Somewhere in that crowd was a person who understood angles and distance better than anyone else alive at that time in this land. Someone paced out the curve of each ring. Someone corrected the line when it drifted. Someone carried the plan of it entirely in memory, because no writing has ever been found to hold it for them. That person left no name, no portrait, no grave marker we can point to and say, "Here, this is the one who knew." If you had lived among them, you would have felt the weight of that unspoken plan pressing on every day of your labor. You would have carried your basket without ever seeing the whole shape from above, trusting that the pattern was real, even though your eyes could never confirm it from the ground. That trust passed from one basket load to the next, from one generation to another, built something that still stands after 36 centuries of wind and flood. And forgetting, the rings remember them, even if their names are gone. And that, more than any theory, is the part of this story worth sitting with a while longer before the sun goes down on it. We call them the Mound Builders. That is the name we settled on, back when we did not know what else to call them. It is a name for a mystery, not a people. Think about that for a moment and let it sit with you like a stone in your pocket somewhere around 1700 BC, along the banks of a slow bayou in what is now northern Louisiana. People gathered. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language filled their mouths, or what songs they hummed while they worked. All we have is what they left behind in the dirt, and the dirt does not talk. It only holds. Picture the bayou at dawn. Back then, mist would have hung low over the water, thick and soft as a wet blanket. Cypress trees would have stood in the shallows, like old men leaning on canes, their roots gnarled and dark. The air would have smelled of mud and green growing things, of fish and wood smoke somewhere close. A fire would have been burning low, and somebody would have been tending it, feeding it small sticks, watching the smoke curl up into a sky just starting to turn from black to grey. Life here would have moved slow and steady, the way a river moves when it is not in a hurry. People fished these waters with nets and spears. They gathered nuts in the fall, thick-shelled pecans and hickory nuts that they cracked open with stone tools, patient as anything. They hunted deer in the low woods, and they knew this land the way you know the inside of your own house in the dark. Every bend in the bayou, every good fishing hole, every place the ground stayed dry after a hard rain. They did not farm the way people farmed later on. There was no need. The land gave enough on its own, if you knew how to ask it right. Children would have run along the water's edge, laughing, chasing frogs, getting mud between their toes. Mothers would have sat in the shade, weaving baskets from river cane, their fingers moving fast and sure, a rhythm passed down from their own mothers before them. Old men would have sat together telling stories, the kind of stories that get told 1,000 times and never wear thin. At night, fires would have dotted the camp like low stars. People would have eaten together, shared what the day had given them, and talked in low voices as the dark closed in around the light. Somewhere, a baby would have cried and been hushed. Somewhere, an old woman would have hummed a tune nobody remembers now. This was an ordinary evening in an ordinary place, for people living an ordinary life. If you had walked into that camp back then, nobody would have looked up twice. You would have seen people mending nets, smoking fish over low fires, trading small talk the way neighbors do. You would have seen no kings, no palaces, no armies, just families, living close to the water, close to the land, close to each other. And yet, somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary living, something extraordinary was happening too. These same hands that wove baskets and mended nets were also moving earth, basket by basket, load by load. They were building rings in the ground, so large that no one person could ever see the whole shape at once. They were shaping the earth itself into something with a plan, a pattern, a purpose we still cannot fully name. This was not a task handed down by a king. There is no evidence of one ruler standing over them with a whip or a crown. This was something people chose to do together, over and over, season after season, for reasons they never wrote down anywhere we can read. If you had asked one of them why, standing there in the mud with a woven basket of dirt on your hip, you might have gotten an answer that made perfect sense to them, and none at all to us. Maybe it was about the sky. Maybe it was about the dead. Maybe it was simply about being together, about making something that would outlast every person who touched it. We do not know. That is the plain truth of it. What we do know is this. While the rest of the ordinary world went about its ordinary business, fishing and weaving and telling old stories by firelight, something uncommon was rising out of the ground beneath their feet, slow, deliberate, patient as the bayou itself, and they were the ones who built it. These people we can only call, for lack of a better name, the Mound Builders. Here is a strange fact for you. In 1873, a man named Samuel Lockett rode across the fields of northeast Louisiana with a survey chain over his shoulder. He worked for the state. His job was to map the land, not to solve a mystery. But when he reached a certain patch of ground near the Mississippi River, he stopped his horse and stared. The ground rose and fell in perfect rings, 6 of them, one inside the other, wide as city blocks, curving away toward the trees like ripples frozen in dirt. Lockett had studied geometry. He knew what a circle was supposed to look like. He did not expect to find one this size, built by hand, sitting quiet in the middle of a cotton field. He wrote it down. He drew a map. And then, for the most part, the country went right on, forgetting it existed. That is the strange part of this story. Not that the rings were built, that they were built and then buried in silence for thousands of years, and then found again, and still almost nobody noticed. If you had opened a school book in 1890 anywhere in America, you would not have read a single page about Poverty Point. The rings were older than Rome, older than the pyramids at Giza, some say, by a few centuries. And the nation that grew up around them treated the whole thing like a footnote nobody bothered to read. Part of the reason is simple. The people who built the rings were gone long before any European ship crossed the Atlantic. There was no one left standing on that ground in 1873 to say, "This is ours. Our grandmothers built this. Here is what it means." The settlers who found these earthworks scattered across the Mississippi Valley had no names to attach to them, no chief to ask, no elder to sit with, just dirt shaped with more care than most cathedrals, and total silence where the answers should have been. So people guessed, and the guesses were not kind. For most of the 1800s, the popular belief was that native people could not have built these rings at all. Newspapers ran stories about lost tribes of Israel. Preachers gave sermons about wandering Greeks or shipwrecked Vikings who supposedly taught the savages how to move earth. It sounds foolish now, and it was, but it tells you something important about how deep the forgetting really went. A whole nation looked at proof of genius sitting in its own backyard and decided the people living on that same land could not possibly be responsible for it. Picture standing in Lockett's boots that day in 1873. You feel the chain in your hand, cold and stiff with dew. You look at the far ring, and it bends away from you in a curve so smooth it seems drawn with a compass. Though no compass that large existed anywhere near this field, cotton grows in the low ground between the rings. Mules pull plows over dirt that took hundreds of years and thousands of workers to shape. Nobody working that field that morning knows what they are standing on. That is the quiet tragedy folded into this mystery. Not just that we don't know who built the rings. It's that for 100 years, we actively decided not to find out. Landowners graded parts of the site flat for farming. A road cut straight through one of the outer rings. A gas plant went up on the property in the 1900s, indifferent to the shape beneath it. Each small act erased a little more evidence, the way rain slowly wears the edge of a footprint. Some researchers argue this forgetting was not really an accident. They say it served a purpose. If the builders were framed as some vanished mystery race, then the living native nations of the Mississippi Valley could be dismissed as newcomers with no deep claim to the land. Other historians push back on that reading. They say the forgetting was simpler and sadder, just ordinary neglect. A young country too busy expanding to look down at what it was already standing on. Both theories can be true at once. Indifference and erasure do not cancel each other out. They feed each other. What survived is the shape itself. 6 rings, a little worn now, still curving through the Louisiana grass like the memory of something enormous. The people who raised that dirt left no name behind for us to call them, but the ground remembers the work, even after the workers and the reasons and the memory of them were almost let go completely. Ask the people who live near Poverty Point what they know, and you will hear 100 small stories before you hear one big one. Some of it comes from old survey notes. Some of it comes from grandfathers who walked these fields before the trees came back. And some of it, the strangest part, comes from the sky itself and what people saw when they finally looked down instead of straight ahead. For most of the town's history, nobody thought to look down. You cannot see a ring when you are standing inside it. The curve is too wide, too slow, too patient for your eyes to catch. A farmer walking his fence line in 1920 would have felt the ground rise and fall under his boots, gentle as a breath, and thought nothing of it. He was standing on a shape so large that only a bird or a god could have seen it whole. That changed in the middle of the last century when a small plane flew low over the fields near the Bayou Macon. The pilot was not looking for anything ancient. He was likely surveying timber or checking a levee. But the light hit the ground at an angle. The shadows stretched long across the winter grass, and suddenly the fields below him stopped looking random. 6 curves swept out from a center point, like ripples on a pond that had frozen mid-splash. From the ground, it had been dirt. From the air, it was a plan. Word spread through the parish, the way word always spreads in small places. Somebody at the feed store heard it from the pilot's cousin. Somebody at church heard it from somebody at the feed store. Old-timers who had farmed that land their whole lives started swapping stories they had never thought worth telling before. One man remembered his father plowing up a stone axe head that had traveled, by later reckoning, hundreds of miles to get there. Another remembered a low ridge his mule always stumbled on, right where a survey crew would later mark the edge of a ring nobody could explain. You would have felt that shift too if you had lived there then. The land under your own house might have suddenly meant something you never knew to ask about. The rings themselves, once mapped, showed something the local farmers had never noticed by walking them, one field at a time. They were not just curved, they were aimed. Lines drawn from the center of the rings out toward the horizon lined up, again and again, with points where the sun rose or set on the solstice, the 2 days each year when daylight reaches its longest and its shortest. Nobody in town had built a calendar out of dirt on purpose, but it looked from above exactly like one. This is where the theories start pulling in different directions, the way they still do today. Some people who study the sky and the ground together believe the rings were laid out with real astronomical intention, that the builders tracked the sun's path across years and pressed that knowledge into the earth itself, ring by ring, basket by basket of dirt. It would mean these people watched the horizon the way we watch a clock and trusted it enough to build a monument to it. Other researchers are more careful with that claim. They point out that with a shape this large, you can find an alignment to almost anything if you're willing to look hard enough. Draw enough lines out from a wide enough circle, and some of them will hit a solstice point by chance alone. They are not saying the builders knew nothing of the sky. They are saying we should be humble about how much of the pattern is real and how much is us, wanting so badly for it to mean something that we find the meaning ourselves. Both ideas can sit at the same table without one killing the other. Maybe the builders watched the horizon closely for their own reasons, tied to planting or gathering or ceremony we no longer have a name for. And the solstice lines are real, or maybe the shape was built for gathering people, not gathering light. And the sky alignment is a happy accident we notice thousands of years later, looking for meaning the builders never intended. The old-timers near the site never settled the argument, and they were not trying to. They just kept adding pieces. A story about a plow that struck stone. A story about a shadow that fell strange in December. A memory of a grandmother who called the rise in the field the old ring. Long before anyone had proven a ring was there at all, no single voice in that town ever had the whole shape. Stand at the center ring on the morning of the summer solstice and watch the sun rise. It comes up over a low place on the horizon, right where one of the aisles between the mounds opens like a gate. This is not luck. This happens every year, on the same day, in the same place, and it has happened that way for 36 centuries. Someone planned it. Someone stood on this ground long before Rome had a name and pointed at the sky and said, "Build it there. Think about what that means." 2. Line up a ring of earth with a sunrise. You need more than strong arms and baskets of dirt. You need years of watching. You need someone, or many someones, tracking the sun across the horizon, season after season, marking where it rose in winter, where it rose in summer, and where it crossed in between. You need patience that outlasts a single lifetime. And then you need the will to move that knowledge into the ground itself, one basket load at a time, until the whole site becomes a kind of calendar you can walk inside. We do this today with steel and glass. We call it an observatory, and we put it on a hill, and we teach children to be proud of it. 3,600 years ago, without metal tools, without the wheel, without a single draft animal to help haul the load, someone did the same thing with dirt and sweat and memory. They turned the earth itself into an instrument for reading the sky. If you had stood inside those rings on the morning of the solstice, the sun would have risen exactly where they meant for you to see it, and you would have felt, for just a moment, like the whole site was built around your own 2 eyes. Here is where the mystery deepens instead of clearing up. We do not know if the solstice alignment was the reason for the rings, or only one reason among many we cannot see. Some researchers who study the site closely believe the mounds and ridges track more than the sun. They think certain sightlines may point toward the rising and setting of particular stars, markers that would have meant something to a hunting people who read the sky the way we read a clock. Other researchers push back hard on this. They say, it is easy to find alignments if you look for them. Any large enough sight, pointed in enough directions, will eventually line up with something in the sky. Draw enough lines across a circle, and a few of them will always hit a star. Both sides agree on one thing. The people who built this were watching the sky for a very long time before they ever moved the first basket of soil. That kind of sky watching does not come from a single generation with a clever idea. It comes from grandparents teaching grandchildren where the sun sets in the cold months and where it sets in the warm ones, passed down by voice alone because there was no writing to hold it steady. Somewhere in that chain of memory, someone decided the knowledge was worth putting into the ground forever, in a shape that would outlast every person who carried the story. That decision is the real mystery here. More than the mounds themselves, somebody looked at the turning sky and thought, this matters enough to build a monument no one built again at this scale in North America for 1,000 years. Not for a king, not for a god with a name we know, for a sunrise, for a turning point in the year that told hunters when to move, when to gather, when the fish would run and the deer would fatten for winter. The rings may have been a calendar the whole community could walk inside, season after season, long after the last person who understood the stars firsthand had died. You can feel the weight of that if you stand there at dawn today. The fog sits low over the ridges, silver and slow, and the light comes up gold behind the gap in the mounds, exactly where it always has. Nothing about that gap is an accident. Somebody's eyes were on this same horizon long before your ancestors or mine ever set foot on this continent. The solstice still knows where to rise. We are the ones who forgot who taught it to. In the 1950s, a man named James Ford stood in a cotton field in northern Louisiana and looked down at dirt that other men had walked past for 100 years. He was an archaeologist, trained to see what farmers could not. He had a hunch that the low rings under his boots were not natural hills at all. What he found, once he started digging, would make him question everything he thought he knew about the people who lived on this continent before anyone wrote their names down. Before Ford, this land was just a farm. Cotton grew in long rows across ridges that rose and fell like slow waves. The rows had been planted the same way for generations, and the plows had cut through the same mounds every spring without anyone asking why the ground rose and fell in such an odd, regular way. If you had walked that field in 1900, you would have seen nothing but crops and dirt roads, a place like 1,000 other places in the Mississippi Delta. Ford did not have modern tools. He did not have satellites or ground-penetrating radar. He had a shovel, a notebook, and a stubborn feeling that would not leave him alone. He walked the property with a surveyor's eye, measuring distances between the low ridges, and the numbers he wrote down did not make sense at first. The ridges were not random. They curved in a way that felt deliberate, like the edge of a giant wheel half buried in the soil. He kept digging. Under the topsoil, he found something no farmer had ever noticed. Layers of packed earth, laid down in bands, each one a different color from the last. Dark soil sat on top of orange clay, which sat on top of gray silt, over and over, like pages in a book nobody could read. Whoever built this had carried soil from different places and packed it down with purpose. This was not the work of wind or river or accident. Then came the aerial photographs. In the 1950s, the Army Corps of Engineers had flown over the region taking pictures of the land for mapping purposes, and Ford requested copies. When he laid those photographs on a table and looked down at the field from above, he saw what centuries of farmers walking the ground had never seen. 6 enormous rings, nested inside each other like ripples in a pond, stretched across 3/4 of a mile. From the ground, you would have called them low hills. From the sky, they were unmistakable. They were a city with no name, and someone had planned it that way. Picture standing at the center of those rings on a grey winter morning. Cotton stubble crunching under your boots, mist hanging low over the fields around you. From where you stand, the ridges look like nothing at all, just gentle rises in a farm field. You would have no way of knowing you stood inside the heart of one of the largest earthworks ever built in North America. That is what makes this discovery strange. The people who built it made something so large that only the sky could see its true shape. Ford's dig raised as many questions as it answered. Radiocarbon dating, done later by other researchers, pushed the age of the site back further than anyone expected, to around 3,600 years ago. That number startled people. It meant this place predated the pyramids of Egypt by some counts, built by people with no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals to haul dirt. Every ridge, every ring, had been carried basket by basket on human backs. Not everyone agreed with what Ford believed the site meant. Some archaeologists argued the rings were built up gradually over centuries, added to bit by different generations, with no single grand design. Others, looking at the same evidence, insisted the geometry was too precise, too consistent, to be anything but a plan carried out on purpose, maybe even in a single sustained push of labor. That argument has never fully settled. The dirt does not explain itself, and the people who moved it left no words behind to settle the matter. What Ford did prove, beyond doubt, is that the rings were not natural, and they were not an accident of erosion or flooding. Someone had chosen this exact spot on the Mississippi floodplain, and someone had organized enough labor to move dirt by the ton, load after load, until the shape they imagined took form in the earth itself. If you had watched it happen, you would have seen hundreds of people working in silence, generation after generation, building something whose true shape none of them would ever see from the ground. Ford spent the rest of his career trying to understand what he had found under that cornfield. He never fully succeeded. The rings kept their silence, the way they had for 36 centuries, and they are keeping it still. A woman who worked the digs at Poverty Point back in the 1950s once said the dirt itself felt different in her hands. Not heavier, not darker, just different. The way a stone from your own yard feels different than one from a stranger's field. She spent 3 summers on her knees with a trowel, and she said, the ground gave up its secrets slow, like it was deciding whether to trust her. What she found, and what others found beside her, tells its own kind of story. No pot shards from a single style, no single set of tools that says one people lived here and only here. Instead, the soil held copper from the Great Lakes, more than 800 miles north. It held flint from Ohio and Indiana. It held soapstone from Alabama and Georgia, carved into small bowls and cooking stones the size of a fist. If you had knelt in that same dirt, brushing soil from a stone that started its life 1,000 miles away, you would have felt the weight of a question with no easy answer. How did it get here? Who carried it? What did they trade for it? And what did they believe about the place they were bringing it to? The little clay balls are the strangest of all. Diggers call them Poverty Point objects now, because nobody knew what else to name them. They are shaped like nothing else in the archaeological record of North America. Some are round, some are shaped like footballs, or bicones, or cylinders with grooves pressed into the sides by human fingers before the clay ever saw fire. Millions of them turn up in the earth here, millions. A man who spent his career studying them once said he stopped trying to guess their number and started guessing what they meant instead. The leading idea is simple enough to say out loud. The builders had no stone for cooking. The nearest hard rock sat hundreds of miles away, and hauling that much stone for everyday fires made no sense. So they shaped the local clay into these small objects, heated them in the coals, and dropped them into cooking pits to hold heat the way stones would elsewhere. Practical, almost humble. But the theory has a hole in it, and careful people admit the hole out loud. Some of the objects show no burn marks at all. Some are shaped with a care that goes past what cooking would ever require. Patterns pressed into the surface that serve no purpose a fire needs. If they were only meant for heat, why decorate the ones that never touched flame? A few researchers have wondered if some of the clay pieces carried a different weight entirely. Counting tools, maybe. Markers for a trade, or a ceremony, or a season. Nobody can prove it. Nobody can rule it out either. The clay stays quiet about its own purpose, the way the mounds stay quiet about the hands that raised them. Then there are the bones, and here the silence gets even deeper. Almost none turn up here. No cemetery, no burial mound packed with the dead the way later mound-building cultures across the Mississippi Valley would fill their earthworks with generations of their own people. A place built at this scale, worked by this many hands, and yet it seems to have almost nothing to say about how its own people died, or where they laid them down. When they did, one archaeologist called it the quietest loud place in North America. Loud in its earthwork, loud in its trade goods, loud in the sheer labor stacked into every ridge of dirt, silent about the faces behind it, silent about the names they called each other, the songs they sang while they worked, the reasons they chose this exact bend of the river and not another 130 miles south. If you stood in that excavation trench in the deep Louisiana heat, sweat cutting lines through the dust on your arms, you would have understood why the woman who worked there for 3 summers called the dirt different. Every layer she lifted answered one question and opened 3 more. The baskets rotted centuries ago, but the shape of their weave sometimes survived, pressed into clay like a fossil of something soft and gone. What she carried home, she said, wasn't an answer. It was a feeling. The feeling of touching something built with intention, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, even when nobody left behind a single word telling us what that was. In 1953, a man named James Ford stood in a cotton field in northern Louisiana with a set of aerial photographs in his hand. He had asked the Army Corps of Engineers to fly over the site and take pictures from the sky. He was not looking for anything strange. He just wanted a better map of the ground before he dug into it. What he saw in those photographs made him sit down right there in the dirt. The rings were not scattered. They were not random bumps left by old rivers or old floods. From the air, 6 earthen half circles nested inside each other like ripples on a pond after a stone drops in. They wrapped around a plaza large enough to hold thousands of people. No one on the ground had ever seen it whole. You would have needed wings. Think about what that means for a moment. The people who built this could never once see their own work the way we see it now. They never flew over it. They never stood on a hill high enough to take in the full shape. They built something so precise, so mathematically clean, that it would take an airplane 3,000 years later to prove they had done it on purpose. If you had walked that field in 1952, 1 year before the photographs, you would have seen only long, low rises in the cotton, nothing more than gentle waves in the land. The truth was hiding in plain sight the whole time, waiting for someone to look down from above. Ford was not the first person to notice mounds at Poverty Point. Locals had known about the tall central mound for generations. Farmers plowing around it, hunters using it as a landmark, but nobody had connected the mound to the rings. And nobody had connected the rings to each other, because nobody could see the pattern from where they stood. The ground itself hid the shape. That is the first strange thing this site teaches you. Some truths are only visible from a distance no human being at the time could have reached. Once Ford saw the rings, he started measuring them, and the numbers only deepened the mystery. Each ridge ran for miles if you added up every curve and turn. The engineers he worked with started asking a question that still has no easy answer. How do you build something this size, this exact, without the tools people usually use to build big things? No metal shovels, no wheels, no oxen or horses to haul dirt in carts, just baskets woven from cane and hide, carried on human backs, load after load after load, for years. Later surveys pushed the numbers even further. Researchers using better equipment calculated that the builders moved close to 1 million cubic yards of earth to raise the mounds and shape the rings. Picture a dump truck, then take away the truck. Picture a bulldozer, then take away the bulldozer. What remains is only people, walking the same path over and over, each one carrying maybe 30 or 40 pounds of dirt at a time. The math does not fully add up to comfort. It adds up to a labor no single family, no single band of hunters passing through could have managed alone. That is where one theory starts to take shape, and it competes directly with another. Some archaeologists believe Poverty Point was a true population center, home to hundreds or even thousands of people living there year-round, farming the river bottoms and building in every spare season. Others look at the surprising lack of ordinary house remains, the missing hearths and trash pits you would expect from permanent homes, and argue instead that people gathered here only at certain times of year. They would arrive from many directions, build for weeks, trade, feast, and then scatter home again before the rings sat empty until the next gathering. Both theories agree on one thing. Whoever came here, however often they came with a plan already fixed in their minds. Nobody stumbles into 6 perfect nested rings by accident. Nobody wanders into a plaza that lines up as cleanly as this one does. Somebody carried the whole shape of it in their head, maybe passed down from someone older, long before the first basket of dirt ever left the ground. Ford spent the rest of his career trying to explain what his own map had shown him, and he never fully could. The rings answered one question and opened 10 more. That is the shape this mystery takes at every turn. Every time researchers think they have found the edge of it, the ground gives them one more curve, running out past the tree line, out past where the plow has ever reached, out into the unrecorded dark of everything still left in the soil. Let's go back to the ridge itself, stand at the base of the biggest one, and look up. It rises taller than a grown man, taller than a doorway, a long shoulder of packed earth curving away from you in both directions until it disappears into the trees. This is Mound A, and the people who study this place call it that, because they never learned its real name. Nobody did. The builders left no sign to tell us what to call their own work. Walk the length of it, and your legs will feel the climb. The mound stretches over 700 feet, longer than 2 football fields laid end to end, and it rises more than 70 feet above the flat delta ground around it. From where you stand, the shape looks less like a hill and more like a bird with its wings spread, though you would never know that from the ground. You would need to rise above it the way a hawk rises to see the wings at all. The people who built it never had that view. They built it blind to its own shape, trusting a plan they carried only in their heads and in stakes driven into soft ground. Now, think about how it got here. There were no wheelbarrows in this river valley 36 centuries ago. There were no carts, no oxen, no horses, no metal shovels to bite into the earth. There was only human strength. One basket of dirt at a time, carried on the shoulder or balanced on the hip, dumped and carried again. Some of the soil came from pits dug close by. Some of it, strange as it sounds, was hauled from miles off, chosen for a color or a texture the builders wanted in a certain layer, like a baker choosing one flour over another for the crust, and a different flour for the crumb inside. Try to hold that thought the way you would hold a heavy stone, millions of basket loads, not for one season, but stretched across years, maybe generations, with no single boss standing over the workers, and no written order telling them where to dump the next load. And yet the mound holds its shape. The layers sit in patterns that repeat with a kind of care you would expect from a mason, not from a crowd of strangers working without a foreman. Around this great mound, the ground itself has been shaped into rings, 6 of them, one nested inside the next, like ripples frozen on a still pond after someone dropped a stone in the center. Time and the plow have worn them down. Today, they rise only a few feet in most places, easy to miss if a farmer's tractor rolls right over them without a second glance. But when the site was surveyed properly, the arcs came back so exact, so evenly spaced, that the surveyor doing the measuring had a hard time believing the numbers on his own map. Nature does not usually draw with a compass. People do. And here, it seems, people did. If you had walked this ground before the earthworks rose, you would have found nothing but flat delta soil and river cane, the kind of place a person passes through, not the kind of place a person builds a monument. Something changed that. Something drew people here and convinced them the effort was worth it, worth the aching shoulders and the years of hauling dirt basket by basket under a sun that does not go easy on the lower Mississippi Valley. We do not know what that something was. We only know the wall of dirt it left behind. There is a theory that the rings were the base for houses, that families once lived along these ridges in a rough circle, cooking fires burning in neat rows, facing the plaza at the center. There is another theory, that no one lived here at all, in the way we mean the word home, that this was a gathering ground, filled for a season, then left quiet, for months at a time, until the next reason to return. Both theories rest on the same soil. Neither one has won. What stays solid, no matter which theory you lean toward, is the labor itself. Somebody planned this. Somebody walked this flat ground and saw, in their mind, a shape that did not yet exist. 6 rings and a bird-shaped mound rising over a river that has since shifted its course more than once. They convinced others to believe in that shape enough to carry dirt for it, day after day, without ever seeing the finished form from above. If you stood where they stood, on the raw ground before the first basket was ever emptied, you would have seen nothing. You would have had to trust a picture that lived only in someone else's head. That is the part of this mystery that never quite lets go of you. There is one more shape at Poverty Point. It sits apart from the rings, off to the northwest, and it does not follow their pattern at all. The locals call it Motley Mound. But if you climb it and look back down the slope, you will see why some people gave it a different name a long time ago. They called it the Serpent. From the ground it looks like nothing, just a long ridge of dirt, humped in the middle, tapering at both ends. Grass covers it now, and pine trees crowd its edges. You could walk past it and never think twice. It looks like a low hill that nature left behind, tired and unfinished, That is the trick of it. That is the trick of almost everything here. But look at it from above, the way we can now with cameras in the sky, and the hill stops looking like a hill. It looks like a body, a long spine that curves once, gently the way a snake curves when it is moving slow across warm sand. One end tapers to a point, like a tail. The other end swells, wider and rounder, like a head lifted just slightly off the ground. Nobody put scales on it. Nobody carved eyes into the dirt. It is only a mound made of the same soil as every other mound on the site. And yet the shape holds. It holds from every angle in the air. Think about what that means for the builders on the ground. A person standing at the tail could not see the head. A person at the head could not see the tail. There was no hill nearby to climb, no tower, no way to check the work from above. If you had stood at the base of that mound while it was rising, load after load of basket-carried dirt, you would have seen only the small piece in front of you. You would have trusted the ones counting your steps to know the whole. The whole shape only exists for someone who was never there when it was built. It exists for the sky, or for whoever they believed was watching from it. That is the part people cannot get past. A serpent mound only means something if somebody, somewhere, already understood what a serpent looks like from above. Not from the side the way you would see one crossing a path. From above, the way a hawk sees one crossing a field. That is not a common view for a person standing on solid ground, with no wings and no ladder tall enough. Whoever planned this mound was either working from memory of something they had truly seen from a height, or working from an idea passed down so carefully that its proportions never drifted, generation after generation, until dirt finally caught up to the picture in their heads. There is a theory that tries to make this ordinary. Some researchers say the shape is a trick of our own eyes, a pattern we are primed to find, because humans are built to see animals in clouds and faces in wood grain. Erosion did some of the shaping, they say. Centuries of rain cut soft curves into what might have started as straighter lines. The serpent in this telling is us, not them. We built it in our minds long after they finished building it in dirt. The counter to that sits quietly in the numbers. The curve is too smooth, too consistent to be pure accident of weather. The head end is wider by a careful, repeatable margin, not a random slump. If it were only erosion, you would expect a dozen other mounds on this site to have slumped into similar shapes over the same 3,600 years of rain. None of them did. Only this one holds the outline. Only this one keeps its shape from the air, while every other mound nearby stays a mound. Nobody living today can tell you what animal, if any, they meant to build. Maybe it was never a snake at all. Maybe it was a river, remembered as it bent through the valley below. Maybe it was something else entirely, a shape sacred enough to warrant this much labor, this many baskets of dirt, and lost enough now that no word survives to name it. The people who raised it left no carving to explain, no painted wall, no voice. If you stood on top of that mound at dusk, with the pines turning black against a bruised sky, you would feel small in a very particular way. Not because the mound is tall, it isn't especially tall at all. You would feel small because the shape beneath your feet was built for a view no builder could ever have had. And somehow they got it right anyway. Not every scholar who studies Poverty Point believes what you might think they believe. Some of the sharpest doubt about this place comes from the people who know it best. They have spent careers walking these ridges, and they will tell you plainly that the story is not settled, that doubt deserves your attention because it comes from real evidence, not stubbornness. Here is the skeptic's case, and it is a fair one. Poverty Point never looks the same way twice. Fly over it in the morning light, and the rings glow like rope laid out in the grass. Fly over it at noon, and the same rings seem to vanish, flattened by centuries of ploughing and rain. Walk it on foot, and you may not see 6 rings at all. You might see one long rise, then flat ground, then another rise, and nothing that reads as a deliberate whole. Some archaeologists have spent their careers asking whether we are reading a message into the dirt that was never written there. This is the argument from erosion. 3,600 years of Louisiana weather does violent, patient work on an earthen shape. Mississippi River floods have crept close. Cotton plows cut furrows straight through sections of the rings for over a century, dragging soil sideways, softening corners, rounding what may once have been sharp. A ridge that looks gentle today might have been steep and exact in 1600 BC. The skeptics ask a hard question: how much of what we call geometry is really just the memory of geometry worn down until it looks like anything we want it to look like? There is also the matter of scale versus proof. Skeptics point out that early surveyors did not always agree on the ring's shape. Some 19th century maps show ovals. Others show something closer to a horseshoe, broken and open. Even now, precise counts of how many rings existed and how complete each one was shift slightly depending on which survey you trust and which parts of the site had already been damaged by farming before anyone thought to measure them. If the baseline data disagrees with itself, the skeptics argue, maybe the confident modern maps are smoothing out uncertainty that should stay visible. And then there is the oldest skeptical argument of all, the one that has followed Poverty Point since the 1870s. People without metal tools, without wheels, without domesticated animals to haul weight, are not supposed to move this much earth on purpose. It is easier, some argued for decades, to believe the rings are natural river terraces, shaped by flood and current, and later used by people rather than built by them. Nature draws curves too. Rivers meander, wind piles dirt. Maybe human hands only finished what water started. You can stand in the middle of that argument and feel it pull at you from both sides, the way a current pulls at your ankles in water that looks still on the surface. But here is where even the doubters slow down. Soil coring, done carefully, layer by layer, tells a story that flood terraces do not tell. The rings are built in distinct construction stages, with different soil types layered on top of each other, in patterns that rivers do not produce. Water does not stack red clay over grey silt, over black loam in neat courses, the way you would stack bricks. People do that. The layering inside the ridges reads like construction, not deposit, and it repeats across separate sections of the rings, in ways too consistent to be coincidence. Then there is Mound A, the tall earthen mound rising near the rings. Built, current dating suggests, in a matter of months, not centuries. A river does not build a mound in a season. A river does not choose a shape and hold it. Whatever force raised that hill of earth did it with intention, on a timeline that argues hard against any purely natural explanation. So the doubt does not disappear. It just gets more specific, more careful, and honestly more interesting. The honest answer, sitting underneath all of this, is not the rings are fake, or the rings are exactly what they seem. It is smaller and stranger than either. It is this: the site is real, the label was real, and we are still arguing about exactly how much of what we see today matches what stood here 36 centuries ago. If you walked those ridges yourself, camera in hand, hoping to capture the perfect aerial shot of 6 flawless circles, you might come home disappointed. The rings do not perform for you. They sit quietly in the Louisiana heat, half remembered by the land itself, telling you only pieces of what they once were. That incompleteness is not a failure of the site. It might be the most honest thing about it. For a long time, only one kind of answer got printed in books. It came from men who never set foot in Louisiana. They looked at the rings on a map, in a drawing, in a photograph, and they made a decision before they ever asked a question. The people who lived there could not have built this, they said, so someone else must have. You can trace that decision like a footprint pressed into wet clay. It shows up again and again, in report after report, letter after letter. Wandering Israelites, refugees from Atlantis, a lost party of Vikings who paddled up from the Gulf and forgot to write it down. A stray band of Egyptians who crossed an ocean with no boats built for the job. Each theory sounds strange on its own. Together, they tell you something plain and a little sad. Nobody wanted to say the obvious thing out loud. The obvious thing was this: indigenous people of the Southeast, working with baskets and sticks, and their own 2 hands, moved enough earth to fill a small mountain. They did it on purpose, with a plan, over generations. That idea sat right in front of surveyors and scientists for more than 100 years, and most of them looked past it, the way you might look past a stranger's face in a crowd, because you already decided what a stranger should look like. Picture a government surveyor standing at the edge of the rings sometime in the 1870s. He has his instruments, his notebook, his confidence. He writes down the measurements, gets them mostly right, then writes down a guess about who built it, and gets that badly wrong. He never asks the Tunica or the Choctaw or the Caddo living nearby what they remember. If you had stood beside him that day, you would have felt how easy that silence was for him, and how costly it turned out to be for everyone who came after. Not everyone made that mistake. Some believers held a steadier line, even when it cost them standing in their own field. A handful of researchers in the early and mid-1900s looked at the pottery, looked at the stone tools, looked at the layers of dirt, and said plainly that this was the work of ancestors, to people who were still alive, still farming those same river bottoms, still telling stories about a world older than any settler's deed. That was not a popular thing to say in a country still writing Indian nations out of its own history. It got some of them mocked in academic rooms. It got some of them ignored for decades. James Ford was one of the archaeologists who kept circling back to Poverty Point, digging in the 1950s, refusing easy answers, refusing the fantasy explanations that made better headlines. He believed the builders were local. He believed the trade goods, the copper, the flint, the soapstone, came in through exchange, not through some traveling foreign hand. He was often right about the small facts, and wrong about the age, guessing the site was younger than it turned out to be. Later, dating pushed it back nearly 1,000 years earlier than he thought, proving the builders even more remarkable than his own theory allowed. That is the strange gift buried in this story. Every time science corrected itself, it did not shrink the mystery, it grew it. The people who insisted, quietly and without proof of certain details, that local hands built this place, turned out to be closer to the truth than the men who invented Egyptians and Atlanteans to avoid an uncomfortable idea. And still, no one can tell you exactly why the rings were built, or what name the builders called themselves, or what word they used for this place before it had an English name at all. Believing the right people were capable of this took nothing away from the wonder of it. If anything, it added weight to the ground beneath your feet. Standing inside those rings, knowing local families working through generations without writing, without metal, without wheels, moved this much earth into this much order, does something to your sense of what a community can hold together across centuries. That certainty came at a cost for the people who spoke it plainly, and it earned them very little credit in their own lifetimes. But it left the door open for what came next: radiocarbon dating, careful excavation, a slow, grinding correction of the record, decades in the making. The theory that blamed outsiders is mostly gone now, folded into old books nobody reads for facts anymore. What is left is harder to explain and far more remarkable: local people with local tools, building something the rest of the continent would not attempt again for a very long time. By the late 1800s, word had spread about the rings in Louisiana. Men came with shovels and picks, not for science, but for something to put on a shelf. They called it collecting. Really, it was taking. A farmer might find a bead of copper glinting in a furrow, and by nightfall, a dozen strangers stood in his field with tools in their hands. They dug fast, and they dug rough. Nobody wrote down where anything came from, or how deep it sat, or what it lay next to. A clay figurine that once meant something to somebody vanished into a stranger's coat pocket, and with it went the only story it could have told. Picture: a man kneeling in red dirt, sweat cutting lines down his neck, pulling a stone bead from the ground like a tooth. He does not think about who shaped it. He does not wonder why it was buried in a ring of earth, built to some pattern nobody could read. If you had stood at the edge of that field, you would have heard the metal bite into soil, over and over, a sound like something being erased. Each strike of a shovel took away a little more context, a little more chance of ever knowing. The rings had held their secrets through 3,000 years of rain and drought and flood. It took men with pickaxes only a few decades to scatter what was left, and yet the land itself remembers what the diggers could not carry away. Walk the ridges today, and you will notice the trees grow strange along certain rows, stunted in places where the soil runs thin over packed earth, taller and greener, where old refuse pits once held ash and bone and broke down slow over centuries into something rich. The ground does not lie, even when the men who dug it did not care to ask what it meant. Farmers who worked this land for generations learned to read it without knowing why. Certain spots in a field never held water the way the rest did. A foundation poured in the wrong place would crack within a year, no matter how deep the footer went. Old-timers just called it bad ground and moved their barns 20 feet over, the way their fathers had, the way nobody remembers deciding to. There is a low place near the outer ring where cattle will not graze past a certain line, even when the grass grows taller there than anywhere else in the pasture. Ranchers noticed it for years before anyone thought to mention it out loud. A cow will walk right up to that line and turn back, again and again, like the ground has a taste it does not care for. Nobody can explain that in a way that satisfies a scientist, and folks around here are not much interested in explaining it at all. It is simply known, the way you know a road floods after heavy rain. The land carries its own memory, whether or not anyone bothers to write it down. The river helped hide what the men with shovels missed. The Mississippi has shifted its path more than once across these centuries, cutting new channels, swallowing old ones whole. Some believe pieces of the site vanished underwater decades before archaeologists ever arrived with their careful brushes and their grid maps. What the diggers did not steal, the river may have simply taken back. If you had lived in this parish 100 years ago, you might have kept a bead or a stone tool on your mantle without a second thought, the way people once kept arrowheads in cigar boxes. Nobody around you would have called it robbery. It would have looked like curiosity, like a harmless hobby for a slow Sunday afternoon. That is how something so large gets erased, not through one violent act, but through 1,000 small, careless hands. What survived by accident more than design. The deepest layers, the ones too far down for casual digging, held onto their secrets simply because nobody thought to go that deep. It took modern archaeologists decades later, sifting through what remained, to realize how much had already slipped through untrained fingers and into private collections that would never open their doors. Stand on the ridge today, and the field looks peaceful, almost forgetful, grass moving soft in the wind like nothing happened here at all. But the ground still holds its shape in ways the eye catches slow. The soil still remembers where the fire pits burned. The cattle still will not cross that one strange line, whatever the diggers carried off. The land kept enough behind to keep asking its question. Even now, even to you, standing quiet at the edge of something nobody can fully name. Poverty Point was never alone. You need to understand that before we go any further, across the middle of this country, from the Ohio Valley down through the Gulf Plains, there were other rings, other mounds, other perfect shapes cut into the earth by hands we cannot name. Some of them stood for 3,000 years without a scratch. Then the railroad came, and in a single season, some of them were gone. Think about that trade for a moment. A shape that outlasted the fall of ancient Egypt's old kingdom could not outlast a construction schedule. The Cahokia Mounds, up near modern St. Louis, once numbered well over 100. Farmers plowed through dozens before anyone in a university office even knew to ask about them. Railroad crews leveled others to fill in low ground, because a 2,000-year-old ceremonial mound and a pile of dirt looked exactly the same to a man laying track on a deadline. Nobody stopped to sketch what they destroyed. Nobody catalogued the bones, or the beads, or the strange dark soil layers that told you a fire had burned there once, centuries before Columbus was born. If you had stood at the edge of one of those work sites in the 1880s, you would have heard picks and shovels and the low grind of a steam engine. And underneath all of it, without anyone noticing, the sound of the last physical proof disappearing forever. The pattern repeats itself with an unsettling consistency. Newark, Ohio, had earthwork so large and so geometrically exact that surveyors in the 1800s assumed a whole city must have built them, though no city's remains ever turned up nearby. Most of Newark's rings are gone now too, swallowed by streets and a golf course of all things. A golf course. Men in white shoes walk over ground that took 1,000 human backs to build, and most of them never once think about who moved that dirt. Here is the theory that keeps surfacing whenever people compare these lost sites. Some researchers believe these earthwork traditions were never separate stories at all. They think Poverty Point, Cahokia, Newark, and dozens of smaller rings scattered through Louisiana, Mississippi, and the Ohio Valley belonged to a shared way of seeing the world, an idea about sacred shape and sacred ground passed hand to hand across centuries, even across cultures that never left written proof of speaking to each other. Under that theory, the rings were never isolated acts of ambition. They were pages torn from the same wider book, and we've only found a scattered few of them. Other researchers push back hard on that idea, and their argument holds real weight. They point out these sites are separated not just by hundreds of miles, but by hundreds, even thousands of years. Poverty Point predates Cahokia by over 2,000 years. The tools were different, the pottery was different, the layouts, when you study them closely, follow different rules and different proportions. Under this competing view, these were not chapters in one long story. They were separate peoples in separate centuries, arriving at a similar idea for entirely their own reasons. Both explanations agree on One uncomfortable fact: we destroyed the evidence before we understood the question. The Newark earthworks that might have confirmed or denied a connection to Poverty Point are gone under fairways and parking lots. The Cahokia mounds that might have shown a direct line of influence were plowed under before radiocarbon dating even existed as a method. We are left comparing photographs of ruins to describe monuments that were already ruins of something older and more complete. Picture the weight of that loss for a second. Somewhere in Illinois, in Ohio, in a dozen towns without a historical marker, there is a flat field that used to hold an answer. The grass grows there the same as anywhere else. Corn goes in every spring like clockwork. Nobody driving past on the county road slows down, because there's nothing left standing to tell them they should. The shape that would have explained everything is simply not there anymore, plowed into memory by men who were only trying to grow a good crop. That is the real reason Poverty Point matters so much today. It survived almost by accident, tucked into a bend of land that farming never fully reached, spared the fate that swallowed its distant cousins. Every ring you can still walk today at Poverty Point is a rare voice from a chorus that mostly went silent, one of the last shapes still standing from a pattern that once stretched across an entire continent. Whatever answer that wider pattern held, whatever thread connected these builders across centuries and mountains and rivers, most of it is already gone. What remains at Poverty Point is not the whole story. It might be the only page anyone left for us to read. The railroad took the shape of the land, but it could not take what people carried inside their own bodies, passed from a grandmother's hands to a granddaughter's hands, long before any surveyor came with his chains and his stakes. That is where the next piece of this story lives. Not in a museum case, not in a field report, in a small object, wrapped in cloth, kept in a drawer for 100 years, because someone's great-grandmother said it mattered, and nobody dared to argue with her. Think about what survives when a place gets erased. Buildings fall. Fields get plowed flat. Names on old maps get replaced with new names that mean nothing to the ground they sit on. But objects can hide. A woman can wrap a small stone bird in a piece of deerskin and tuck it into a trunk. And that bird can outlive every fence line and every railroad spike laid across the land it came from. If you had opened that trunk in 1920, you would have found a piece of Poverty Point folded quietly inside, waiting. The site has given up thousands of these small objects, and each one raises the same question. Tiny clay balls, baked hard and shaped by hand, appear by the millions across the ridges here. Nobody far away made them. Nobody imported them. The builders made them on site. In fires they built themselves, for a purpose that still gets argued over in university offices 4,000 miles from the dirt they came from. Most researchers now believe these balls were cooking stones, heated in a fire and dropped into pits to bake food, since good rock for that purpose was hard to find in this soft delta soil. It is a plain answer. It is also not the whole answer, because some of the balls show a level of care in their shaping that goes well past what plain cooking requires. Then there are the beads and the small carved figures, cut from copper that did not come from anywhere nearby. That copper traveled from the Great Lakes over 1,000 miles north, through hands and rivers and seasons nobody recorded. Stone for tools and ornaments came from the Ouachita Mountains, from the Ozarks, from as far as the Appalachians. If you had stood at the center of these rings in 1400 BC, you would have been standing at the middle of a trade network that stretched across half a continent, built by people with no wheels, no horses, No written ledger of who owed what to whom. A soapstone bead, carved into the shape of an owl, was found here decades ago, small enough to sit in the palm of a child's hand. The detail on its face is precise. Its eyes are deep-set and round, carved with a patience that speaks of hours spent by firelight, working stone with stone. Nobody knows what the owl meant to the person who made it. Nobody knows if it was worn, buried, traded, or lost. It simply was, and then it simply is again, pulled out of the ground centuries later, asking the same question it always asked. Who were you, and what did you believe was worth carving? The written record on all of this is thin, almost embarrassingly so. Early accounts from the region barely mention the rings at all, tucked into Surveyor's notes as odd rises in the land, worth a sentence and nothing more. But the oral record ran on a different current. Families in the parish passed down stories of a place where the ground had been shaped on purpose, long before any schoolbook used the word archaeology. Grandmothers told granddaughters to leave certain rises alone, to walk around them rather than through them, without always saying why. The knowing did not need an explanation. It only needed to be repeated, gently, from one generation into the next. Skeptics will tell you memory is not evidence, that a family story is not a field report, and they are right to say so. Stories drift, details get added. A rise in a field can become a legend simply because a grandmother said it should. But something is worth noticing here too. The families who kept these small warnings alive were not guessing at the ring's importance. They already knew, long before a single trench was dug, that the ground held something worth respecting. Somewhere in a drawer tonight, in a house not far from these ridges, a small clay ball or a stone bead may still be sitting quietly, wrapped in cloth, waiting for someone to ask where it came from. And somewhere in that same house, a story about the rings may still be getting told at a kitchen table, low and steady, the way it always has been told, long before anyone thought to write it down. Picture a family in West Carroll Parish, sitting down for supper on the winter solstice. Nobody plans it that way. It just happens, year after year, that the shortest day of the year is when the cousins gather. Someone brings a ham, someone else brings up the mounds, because somebody always does. And the story gets told again the way it has been told for longer than anyone at the table has been alive. The grandmother starts it, most times. She says her own grandmother used to walk the ridge at sunrise on the first day of winter, just to stand there and watch the light come up over the rings. She never said why. She just said her people had always done it, and that was reason enough. The children roll their eyes a little, the way children do, but they listen anyway. They always listen anyway. This is how the deepest knowledge about Poverty Point survived the centuries when nobody was writing anything down, not in books, not in museum placards, in kitchens, at tables, in the pause between a story and the next helping of food, when someone leans back and says, "My grandfather used to say, the sun sits right in that gap on the shortest day, and you can set your watch by it." If you had a watch back then. Archaeologists came to this land in the 20th century with transits and survey stakes, certain they were discovering something, certain they were the first to notice that the rings and the aisles between them point toward the solstice, sunrise and sunset, with an accuracy that still unsettles the people who measure it. But the families who had farmed this ground for generations were not surprised. Some of them had already been told the knowledge had been sitting in the soil the whole time, and it had also been sitting in the kitchens, passed hand to hand like a good knife, or a family Bible, worn soft at the edges but never quite lost. Here is the strange part, the part that never sits easy no matter how many times you turn it over. Nobody knows how that knowledge survived. The mound builders left behind no written word, no carved calendar, no message that says, here is what we knew, and here is why we built it this way. And yet, somewhere between then and now, a fragment of their understanding slipped through. Maybe it slipped through the tunica or the natchez, whose ancestors may have carried old stories down through the centuries after the builders themselves were gone. Maybe it slipped through settler families who noticed the same sunrise their neighbors noticed, and started watching for it too, without ever knowing why it mattered. Nobody can trace the thread all the way back. It is just there, in the telling, waiting. If you had grown up on that ridge, you would have known the shape of the sky before you knew the shape of a map. You would have known which gap in the rings caught the first light in December, the way you knew which room in the house got warm first when the stove was lit. You would not have called it archaeology. You would have called it Tuesday or Sunday, or just the way things are done around here. Some families kept small things too, not just stories. A flat stone worn smooth on one side, kept on a windowsill because a great-aunt found it in a plowed field and liked the shape of it. A basket pattern that nobody can explain, sewn the same way for 4 generations, that echoes shapes the earthwork rings make from above, though no one living has ever seen the rings from above with their own eyes. Whether these things are memory or coincidence, nobody can say for certain. The line between an inherited truth and a story that grew comfortable through repetition gets thin after 3,000 years, and it never gets thick again. What stays constant, table after table, decade after decade, is the shape of the telling itself. A grandmother stands at a ridge at dawn. A gap in old earth catches the light. A child grows up, forgets for a while, then remembers again at their own table, with their own grandchildren half listening over dinner. The story does not ask to be believed. It only asks to be passed along, the same way the earth was passed along, handful by handful, 3,600 years ago, by people who never once wrote down their names. If you sat at that table tonight, you would feel it too. Not proof, not evidence you could carry into a courtroom or a lecture hall. Just the quiet weight of something old, resting gently on the back of your neck, telling you that some knowledge does not need paper to survive. It only needs someone willing to watch the sunrise, and someone willing to listen when they talk about it. Walk the ridges at Poverty Point in late summer, when the Louisiana heat sits heavy on your shoulders like a wet coat, and you will notice something odd about the ground. The grass grows thick and green across most of the site, but along certain lines on certain ridges it grows thin, patchy, almost reluctant. Local farmers noticed it long before any archaeologist showed up with a clipboard, and they never had a tidy explanation for it either. Soil scientists will tell you this is simple chemistry. 3,600 years of compacted earth holds water different than the ground around it. Minerals shift, drainage changes. Grass roots find some soil hospitable and some soil stubborn, and there is nothing mysterious about clay that refuses to loosen its grip. That answer satisfies the mind. It does not always satisfy the feet standing on that ridge, watching healthy grass stop dead at a line no one can see from ground level, only from above. You do not need to believe in anything strange to feel it. Stand where the green stops and the brown begins, and you feel the weight of deliberate work under your boots, even if you cannot say what kind of weight it is. The rings were shaped by hands, by baskets of dirt, carried one load at a time, by people working together towards something they understood and we do not. That effort left a mark in the soil that outlasted their names, their language, their entire memory of themselves. The ground remembers what the history books could not keep. This is the quieter truth, sitting underneath every argument about who built these rings and why. Strip away the theories about ceremony, trade, astronomy, and government. Strip away the arguments between the mound builder myth and the archaeologists who spent 100 years correcting it. What is left is simpler and somehow heavier. Something happened here that mattered enough to move dirt by the ton, without oxen, without metal, without any tool sharper than a sharpened stick and a woven basket. That kind of effort does not happen by accident, and it does not happen without a community believing in the reason behind it. You do not need a name for the builders to understand this. A family stood on this ridge once, in a summer no different in its heat than the one you are standing in now, and passed a basket of dirt from one set of hands to the next. A child watched an elder set a stone with more care than a stone alone should need. Somebody argued about where the next ridge should curve, and somebody else won that argument. And the curve we walk today is the fossil of a disagreement nobody recorded. If you had stood there with them, you would not have known you were building something that would outlast every language your people ever spoke. That is the part worth sitting with, more than any theory about astronomy or trade routes. The rings prove devotion before they prove anything else. They prove that a group of people, whoever they were, decided this ground mattered more than convenience, more than ease, more than the shorter path of simply not building at all. 10 centuries later, cotton farmers plowed through what was left, dragging blades through soil that still held the shape of that decision. And the shape held anyway. It held through floods, through decades of neglect, through a nation that forgot the builders' names entirely. Some archaeologists now speak of the site less like a puzzle to be solved, and more like a message they are still learning to read, not a message in words, since none were left but a message in scale and shape and choice. Others resist that framing entirely, worried it edges too close to mysticism dressed up as science. Both sides agree on one thing though, and it is the thing that matters most. Standing on that patchy grass, somebody cared enough to build this. Somebody's whole community organized itself around care. The rings do not need a settled name for their builders to hold that meaning. They do not need a tidy theory to explain why the grass grows wrong along certain lines. What they hold, plainly and without argument, is proof that human beings once gathered here with purpose, worked together towards something bigger than any single life, and left the ground changed in a way that 36 centuries could not undo. That is not a mystery waiting for an answer. That is the answer, sitting quietly under your feet, waiting for you to notice it. Picture it after dark. The sun has gone down behind the tree line, and the sky over West Carroll Parish turns the color of a bruise, fading to black. You are standing near the rings now, though you cannot see them the way you could at noon. The mounds are just shapes now, darker shapes against a dark sky, and the flat ground between them has become a kind of held breath. This is a quiet county. People here do not talk much about the rings, not because they are afraid, but because the rings have always just been there, the way a hill is there, the way a river bend is there. You ask a man at a gas station in Epps what he thinks the mounds are for, and he shrugs and says his granddaddy used to hunt rabbits out past them. That is the whole conversation. The mystery does not feel urgent to the people who live beside it every day. It has become furniture in their lives, and there is something in that too, something about how the impossible can sit right next to the ordinary for so long that folks stop seeing it as impossible at all. But you are not from here, and tonight the rings are new to you, and the dark makes them feel larger than they did in daylight. Stand at the edge of the plaza, where the earth opens into that great half-circle a football field could not fill. Listen. The wind moves through the switch cane and the loblolly pines at the tree line, and it sounds almost like breathing, slow and even, like something old catching its rest. Somewhere out past the ridges, an owl calls once, then waits, then calls again, and the sound carries flat and clean across the open ground, the way sound only carries in places with no walls to catch it. Above you, the sky over Louisiana, in a place with no city lights nearby, is thick with stars, more stars than you are used to seeing, scattered like salt thrown across black cloth. You can find the bright band of the Milky Way if you tilt your head back far enough, a pale smear running corner to corner over the ridges. The builders of this place saw this same sky, night after night, for generations. They did not have street lamps or porch lights competing with it. The stars were their ceiling, and the solstice sun was their clock. And you are standing in the exact spot where they once stood, watching the same wheel of light turn overhead. Feel the ground under your boots. It is soft in places, spongy with pine needle rot, and firm in others where the old clay core of the mound still holds its shape after 36 centuries. If you crouch down and put your palm flat against the ridge, the dirt is cool and a little damp, and it holds the day's warmth, just barely, the way a stone holds heat after the sun leaves it. This dirt was carried here basket by basket, by hands that have been gone longer than most of the world's religions have existed. You are touching their work. You are touching thousands of individual choices, thousands of trips back and forth from a borrow pit to this ridge, and none of those choices left a name behind. A truck passes on the distant highway, headlights sweeping low and yellow across the tree line, and then it is gone, and the quiet folds back in like water closing over a stone. Crickets keep their steady chorus in the grass. Somewhere a night bird you cannot name lets out 3 thin notes and falls silent. The mounds themselves make no sound at all. They do not need to. Their silence is its own kind of voice, patient and enormous, the way a held breath speaks louder than words once it finally lets go. Standing here, at night, in this county that does not make a fuss over what it has, you start to understand something that daylight visitors miss. The rings were not built to be admired from a viewing platform. They were built to be lived inside, walked through, slept near, worked around, generation after generation, under a sky exactly like this one. If you had stood on this ground 4,000 years ago, cold ground under bare feet, the same stars would have turned slowly overhead, the same owl calls would have crossed the same flat dark. The mystery does not shout out here. It settles into you slowly, the way cold settles into a body left too long in the open air, until you are not thinking about theories or timelines anymore, just about how small you are, and how patient this dark ground has learned to be, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally understand what it is trying to say. There was a man named James Ford who spent his life digging in the dirt of Louisiana. He came to Poverty Point in the 1950s with a shovel, a notebook, and a set of ideas he trusted completely. He believed, like most men of his time, that big earthworks meant a big society. Pyramids need pharaohs, cathedrals need kings. Ford figured the rings needed something like that too. Some chief with an army of workers under his thumb. He dug for years. He mapped the ridges, counted the mounds, tried to fit what he found into a story that made sense to him, and slowly the site fought back against every easy answer. There were no palaces, no throne rooms, No warehouses of grain that would feed an army of laborers, just the rings, the mounds, and a strange quiet where a ruling class should have left its mark. By the end of his career, Ford started saying something that surprised his colleagues. He said maybe he had it backward. Maybe the site was not built by force. Maybe it was built by belief. People might have come here not because a king ordered them, but because something called them. A gathering, a ceremony, a reason strong enough to make strangers pick up baskets of dirt and start walking. Think about what that means for how we understand power itself. We are taught that big things need big rulers, that scale requires command. Poverty Point suggests something gentler and stranger. It suggests that a shared idea can move as much earth as a whip ever could. If you had stood in Ford's shoes, staring at a map that refused to make sense, you might have felt the ground shift under your own assumptions too. Ford was not the last archaeologist to walk into these fields, certain of his framework, and walk out change. Almost every serious researcher who has spent real time here tells some version of the same story. They arrive with a theory. The site erodes it, ridge by ridge, until they are left holding something more honest and less tidy. Poverty Point does not reward confidence. It rewards humility. This shift changed more than academic papers. It changed how the whole region thinks about its own ground. Locals, who once saw the mounds as strange lumps in a cow pasture, began to understand they were standing inside something intentional, something built by minds as sharp as any in history. Schools nearby started teaching about the rings, not as ancient rubble, but as a puzzle worth caring about. Children who grew up climbing Mound A for fun grew into adults who guard it. There is a rhythm to life around here now, shaped by the rings whether people notice it or not. Farmers plow around the ridges instead of through them. Hunters know which fields to leave alone come dusk. Every fall, when the light turns gold and low across the flat land, people drive out just to stand on the mound and watch the sun drop toward the horizon. The builders once tracked with such care. Nobody teaches them to do this. They just feel pulled, the way visitors have felt pulled to this ground for 36 centuries. The state built a small museum near the entrance, modest and quiet, filled with beads and points and broken pottery. Inside, there are maps showing what the rings look like from above, next to old photographs of Ford himself, notebook in hand, squinting at a landscape that would not behave. Visitors walk through slowly, the way people walk through a room where someone important once changed their mind. If you visited today, you would notice how careful the guides are with their language. They do not say the builders worshipped this or believed that. They say we do not know, and they say it without embarrassment. That carefulness itself is part of what the site created. It taught a discipline to be comfortable with mystery, to let a question sit unanswered instead of forcing a tidy ending on it. Ford died before the site earned the recognition it has now, before UNESCO named it a place of world importance, before the rings appeared in textbooks instead of footnotes. He never got to see how far his change of mind would travel, but something of him remains out there anyway, in the same way something of the ancient builders remains. A shift in thinking that started with one stubborn man refusing to force the ground into a shape it never agreed to hold. The rings did not just get studied here, they taught the people who studied them how to think differently, how to hold an answer loosely, how to let a place keep its secret and still call that secret worth protecting. People always ask what a wall of dirt was meant to hold back. That question comes naturally to us. We build walls to keep something out or someone in. But stand inside the rings at Poverty Point and you will not feel a barrier. You will feel an opening. The land does not close around you there. It reaches outward, ridge after ridge, toward the river and the sky beyond it, like arms spread wide instead of arms crossed. A woman named Ruth Calloway grew up not far from these mounds, in a small town in northeast Louisiana, where everybody's grandfather had a story about the dirt rings out past the cotton fields. Her family did not build them. Nobody alive can claim that. But her grandmother told her, when she was a girl, that the rings were not for keeping people away. They were for calling people in. That was the version passed down in her house, whispered over supper, repeated at funerals when relatives came home from as far as Chicago and Houston. Ruth left Louisiana in 1961. She rode a bus north with a suitcase and a photograph of the mounds tucked into her Bible. She settled in Detroit, married, raised 3 children in a narrow house near the river, and rarely spoke of home to anyone outside her family. But every year, on the day after Thanksgiving, she told her children the story of the rings. She told them there was a place in the world shaped like a circle, within a circle, within a circle, built by hands nobody could name, and that circle had no gate and no wall high enough to keep a stranger out. She told them it was built to gather, not to guard. If you had sat at her table in Detroit in the 1970s, you would have heard the Mississippi in her voice, even though the river was 1,000 miles away. Her children remember the cadence more than the details. They remember her saying that the people who built the rings never meant them to protect anything. They meant them to hold people together, the way a hand holds water it does not want to lose. This is how legends travel. They do not need a wagon or a highway. They ride inside a person, folded up small, and they unfold again wherever that person finally sits still. Ruth's daughter, now a school teacher in Ohio, still tells her students about the mounds every autumn, though she has visited the site only once, as a grown woman holding her own mother's hand at the edge of Ridge West. She says the ground felt warm under her boots, though the day was cold. She has no way to explain that. She does not try. Archaeologists have a harder time with stories like Ruth's than they do with soil samples. A carbon date gives a number, a family story gives a feeling, and feelings do not fit easily into site reports. Some researchers set these oral traditions aside entirely, treating them as sentiment rather than evidence. Others argue the opposite, that a story carried faithfully for generations can preserve a truth that pottery never could, a truth about purpose and meaning that no artifact can hold. Nobody has settled which side is right. Maybe nobody ever will. What stays constant, in every version of Ruth's story and in dozens like it, collected from families scattered across the South and beyond, is the same insistence. The rings were never a fortress. They were never meant to shut the world out. If the builders had wanted a wall against danger, they had the labor and the will to raise something sheer and forbidding. They did not. They raised something open, something curved, something that lets the eye travel out toward the horizon in every direction at once. You can feel that openness even now if you walk the ridges at sunrise, when the mist sits low over the bayous and the mounds rise out of it like the backs of sleeping animals. Nothing about the shape says, keep away. Everything about it says, come closer, come together, stand here with the rest of us. That invitation crossed 200 generations and somehow found its way onto a bus headed north, into a kitchen in Detroit, into the voice of a woman none of the builders ever met. Whatever the rings were built for, they were not built out of fear. That much survives every retelling, every migration, every mile between Louisiana and wherever the story finally comes to rest. The mystery is not smaller for that. It is only warmer, carried now in human voices instead of earth, waiting for the next person willing to pass it on. Go to Poverty Point in the last hour of light, and you will feel the day let go of the place slowly, like a hand opening one finger at a time. The heat lifts off the rings first, then the birds change their song, trading the sharp calls of afternoon for something softer, almost like humming. The rangers lock the little visitor center and drive home to Epps, and the rings stay behind, holding their shape in the dark the way they have held it for 36 centuries. If you stood inside that C-shaped row of ridges at dusk, you would feel the ground fall quiet under you before the sky does. The wind moves different across earth that was placed here on purpose. It does not gust the way it does over a natural rise. It slides along the curve of the ridge like it is following a path someone drew for it a long time ago. You would not be able to explain that feeling to a friend back home. You would just know it, the way you know a room has been swept clean before you walked into it. This is the hour when the site stops being a set of measurements and starts being a place again. During the day, the rings are numbers, volume of earth moved, distance between ridges, degrees of arc against the horizon. Numbers are useful. They tell you this could not have been an accident, that 1,000 people or more must have carried baskets of dirt on their backs for years to raise these ridges. But numbers do not tell you what it felt like to stand where you are standing now, and numbers never will. At dusk, the shadows stretch long across the plaza, and for a few minutes the ridges look less like a monument and more like something breathing. Archaeologists will tell you this is a trick of low light and human eyes built to find faces in clouds. They are probably right, but the trick works the same way on a scientist with 3 degrees as it does on a tourist with a paper map from the gift shop. Something in the shape of this place still reaches for you, even now, even after we stripped away every myth about giants and lost tribes and simply have not built new ones to replace them. Nobody living remembers why the builders chose this exact bend of the river, or why they aimed the rings the way they aimed them, or what word they used for themselves. The Caddo and other nations who came after them tell stories about ancestors and old towns along these waters, but no unbroken thread connects a name spoken in 1600 back to the hands that raised this dirt in 1600 BC. That gap is not a failure of memory. It is the simple weight of 3,000 years pressing down between then and now, more time than separates us from the pyramids at Giza. Consider what that means for you, standing here at sundown, with the mosquitoes starting to rise off the bayou. You are closer in time to the builders of Stonehenge finishing their final stones than the builders of Stonehenge were to the people who first raised these ridges. The distance is almost too large to hold in your hands, and yet the dirt under your boots is not abstract at all. It is warm from the day's sun, packed hard by thousands of years of rain, real enough to feel through the soles of your shoes. Maybe that is the real shape of this mystery, more than any ring or ridge. It is not really about who built Poverty Point. It is about how much a people can accomplish and remember perfectly among themselves, and still vanish so completely from written record that we are left guessing at their names. It happened here. It happened at dozens of other sites across this same river valley. It could happen to any of us, and there would be no one left to argue about what to call the ones who stayed behind. The rings do not answer that. They just wait, the way they have waited through droughts and floods, and the plows of farmers who did not know what they were driving over. At dusk, when the light goes soft and gold, and the shadows pool in the low places between ridges, the whole site seems to hold its breath along with you. Nothing moves. Nothing needs to. The silence is not empty. It is full of every question we have not answered yet, settling over the grass like the dew that will be there by morning, waiting for someone else to come stand exactly where you are standing now and ask the same thing all over again. So here we are, back where we started, standing at the edge of the rings, or lying in the dark, picturing them the way you might picture an old friend's face. The fire has burned down to orange coals now, the kind that don't crackle anymore. They just glow, soft and steady, like they're keeping a secret of their own. We never found a name, not one carved into stone, not one whispered down through some unbroken line of grandmothers to grandchildren, not one written on a scrap of bark that survived the wet Louisiana air. The people who moved that much earth, who lined up their rings with a sum that rises the same way every year, who traded for stone and copper across 1,000 miles without a single wheel or a single horse, walked away from the written record entirely. They left the shape of their work behind. They did not leave their voice. That is the strange gift of this mystery. Most stories end with an answer, a name, a date, carved somewhere official. This one ends with a shape in the dirt and a shrug from everyone who has ever studied it closely. The archaeologists will tell you their best guess. The engineers will tell you how the geometry works, how a plaza that size could hold a gathering bigger than the biggest football stadium you have ever sat in. But nobody, not one soul in 3,500 years, has been able to say the words, "This is who we were," and have those words survive. Think about that for a moment, lying there in the dark, somewhere in Louisiana tonight. Those rings are sitting under a sky full of stars, empty and quiet, the way they have sat for longer than most of human writing has existed. No fence keeps the wind out, no guard stands watch. The grass moves a little in the night air, and the old ridges rise up out of the ground like the back of something enormous, sleeping, patient, still there. If you had lived in that place 4,000 years ago, you would have known the answer without needing to write it down. You would have known why the rings faced the way they faced, why the mounds sat where they sat, why people walked for weeks to bring stone from the Ozarks and copper from the Great Lakes, just to lay it down at your feet. The knowing would have lived in your hands and your feet and your daily walk across that plaza.